Attorney General Bill Barr, we've been talking about him. He actually went further than the president. He said the Justice Department will look into whether only citizens should be considered when apportioning the number of representatives and electoral votes each state should receive.
There is a current dispute over whether illegal aliens can be included for apportionment purposes. Depending on the resolution of that dispute, this data may be relevant to those considerations. We will be studying this issue.
However, as NBC News noted earlier today, the Constitution bases that apportionment on the census, which counts persons, not citizens. Congresswoman Lee, let me go to you on that, because I think that moment at the event today in the Rose Garden caught a lot of people by surprise, and they're trying to interpret. How do you interpret what the Attorney General was saying there? Is he teeing up a broader legal fight about how to count people who actually should be counted in the census when it comes to apportionment?
Really laid out exactly what their motivation has been all along. And that has been to make sure that the count in the census is reduced, targeting, of course, people of color, intimidating and trying to scare people of color from filling out the proper census forms. I think they're doing this for political reasons. We have redistricting coming up, and of course they want fewer people who would more than likely vote as Democrats. And so I think from day one that's been their vote of motivation, and I think it's really an attack on our democracy. It's an attack on our Constitution, and this president is showing us once again who he really is. And so I'm certain that when we begin to look at the lawsuits, if in fact they move ahead on that, people will really realize who they are, what they're up to. Remember now, the census determines the funding for schools, for hospitals, for roads. And so we have to make sure we have an accurate count so that the most vulnerable people receive the type of services and benefits that the Constitution requires.
So the argument, though, against the citizen and folks on your side have been making, one of the arguments has been it will not end up leading to an accurate count for the reasons you're saying. There's not going to be a citizenship question now. We know that. It's unclear if this executive order the president's announcing today is actually going to change much in terms of what the government's already doing. But do you think by having such a public fight over this, and the president and his attorney general talking the way they did today, is that going to have any effect, do you think, on who does and doesn't ultimately answer the census next year?
Well, I think the public fight, he's really, if he throws down like he's trying to do, then we have to have that public fight, because this president cannot violate the Constitution. And when you look at what he's trying to do, and when you look at how he's trying to, now that he lost in the courts, because he's a lawless president, quite frankly, and their administration is acting in a lawless way. This public fight will put the debate out front so that everyone will know what they're up to. And in fact, it really is an attack on our democracy. And the census is extremely important for many, many reasons, including what I just said in terms of building hospitals, for schools, for roads, and for every other public service that the most vulnerable communities need. And so if he wants the fight, our lawyers are ready for the fight.
But, you know, this public fight may have this unintended, or maybe it's an intended consequence, which is to make illegal immigrants and also even immigrants who are here legally skittish about participating in the census.
Yeah, right.
I think that if you're nervous about your status, or if there's somebody in your household who is here in an undocumented way, even if you're here legally, it could make you suspicious about doing anything with the government that you don't trust. And so it could contribute to an undercount, even without having the census question on the document.
Sure, even people now are already skittish. I know for a fact in my district, people are worried, quite frankly. Once this proposal to put this question on the census forms came forward, people got worried. They're afraid right now. And so, yes, the chilling effect is happening as we speak. And so it's going to be up to us to try to make sure we communicate the realities of what the protections are of the Constitution and why members of Congress, quite frankly, especially Democrats, are going to fight to make sure that they have the opportunity to fill out these forms without the intimidation and without the bullying of this White House.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.